Hi, I'm Sabrina Monarch, and I know everyone who's here, but for anyone who is watching this recording, welcome. We're talking about astrological writing and the kind of practice and philosophy of it. Today I'm coming from this place. I just kind of wanted to root into a little bit of background about what I do and my transits, and currently I think I've been, of multiple transits I've been really focused in on Saturn being right on my midheaven, and it's also squaring my Venus. My Venus is in Pisces in the first house, and it's a disseminating phase square. And the sensation of having Saturn in my ninth house for a few years, it was kind of like I could keep adding stuff into this kind of infinite bag, like in Harry Potter. They go camping, like Hermione has this bag that just, she can put infinite amounts of things into it. And at the 10th house, there started to be this sense of making priorities and boundary and time and things like that. But I also really got this kind of visceral Saturnian sensation that when I'm thinking maybe about the difference between Saturn and Uranus, where Uranus is future-minded and Saturn wants to look back. And so from that, I've been kind of getting these things bubbling up in my consciousness of kind of history or where I'm coming from, or making sense of the past and how the past has led to this moment in time. And so I've done that for today, just reflecting on what I've learned about astrological writing personally. And so I just wanted to approach it from my personal process and make it universal, as I can, but that I wanted to share kind of what I've learned along the way. A few things that go into that is that I've been into writing since I was a kid. It's been a really natural way for me to want to express myself. At the same time, I've also studied it. I've been part of online writing communities, and I've studied writing in college. And that helped me learn a lot of technical things, and especially around voice. I think voice is really important for writing. It's the sense of like having your own channel, or feeling like you have a distinct character that comes through in your writing style. And that can be, I feel like that's a matter of practice and just familiarity with, even if you have a practice writing in a journal, that is a great way to open up the channel of translating your inner reality into words. And then the more that you do that, the more that your thoughts themselves become full sentences in like a literary, poetic format. And you might also think too, if you want to open that channel of writing more and more, to have a notebook at all times and write down things that appear in your mind, or write down your dreams. Especially when we're talking about astrology, we are putting into words things that are very vast. We're talking about the cosmos. And I think having a dream journal is a good reference point in some way, where often our dreams are Neptunian and beyond. Beyond even, I guess, the mundane kind of dreams, but when dreams are just kind of weird and you're looking for the words, I think dreams can be a great writing exercise to stretch your language capacities to describe things that are beyond ordinary reality. So those are just some basic thoughts on building that channel. And then the other piece that I thought of with that is reading authors that you really connect with their voice. I feel like my life forever changed after I read Anais Nin for the first time. I was so moved by her writing style, and I had never read someone who wrote that way, and it just opened up a whole new dimension for me in terms of thinking. And she has a lot of Pisces stuff, and my Mercury and Venus conjunction are in Pisces, so I think that it just it reflected something at me linguistically that I normally didn't see. And this can be important just for female people, like the sense that a lot of our literary culture can be just like these masculine writers, and often like brilliance like Dostoevsky, and there's a lot of male writers that I love. And finding a feminine or very lunar voice was a huge transition, especially when we're thinking about astrological writing, as we'll get into, where we're talking about something that is mystical and it's moonlit, it's lunar. It doesn't have to be. We can be very technical and rigorous in our astrological writing too. And so there's many different types and forms. So that's one piece of it. I thought also about the sense of routine and making time and space for writing. Again, journal writing can help so much with that, but it's just about building that consistency. And this is for like maybe just kind of starting to get into writing more, or to take more seriously one's writing practice. The next layer of that, in terms of if one already has a writing practice, is having an astrological writing offering that's regular. This was something I picked up from business and kind of marketing communities, was they were always stressing, have a regular offering, do something once a week or once a month, so that you build consistency with an audience. And astrology works really well with that, because we're talking about time. We're studying transits. So that can be just built into astrology itself. When I first started my astrology writing, I had actually just written a novel, and this novel was like my thing. I was working on it for maybe 2 years, and my dream was to publish it, and I thought that I was going to be like a writer in the world. And when I was done with the book, I was kind of sitting at my desk, just like, that was anticlimactic. I kind of expected something else to happen when I finished the last part, because I'd had many kind of peak experiences while writing it, and felt moved by the whole process. But then the end came, and it was like, well, what do I do now? Part of why I was writing it too was this fantasy desire, like, that if I could be a writer in the world, I could have permission to be myself. I wouldn't have to get another job. And I still feel that way as an astrologer, where I really have desired to make astrology my career. So in terms of the writing process with it, it's been a practice of, how does this work pragmatically, and how do I enjoy doing it? Because I really don't want to do anything else. Like, astrology is what I want to do with my life, and that can build into other things. But there's a kind of there's an ability to take really seriously astrology, as I'm sure many of us here and anyone who's watching this is inclined. And I felt this, I guess I'm getting away from my story, but I'll continue with this tangent for just a moment to say that there is this thing in the astrology community that, like, it seemed as like, okay, this can't really be a career. This is something you can do on the side. And I don't think that has to be the case. A lot of astrologers, I feel like, come to this practice with, we're different, we're Aquarian, we're Uranian. Maybe we're insecure about being so passionate about something that is not considered legitimate in every circle. We're not granted the same kind of societal authority as maybe like a doctor. And at the same time, we're offering medicine that is sometimes better than what the doctor in this scenario could give. I don't, I guess, have to be competitive about it like that, but I do think that there's a sense that astrology is valuable, and there is reason to really dedicate energy into it. And for me, because I came into it with writing as my main skill set and passion, that was what I fused into it to make astrology something that I could do. But as I was finishing this book, I asked, I was brainstorming, like, what do I do next in my life while I wait for this book to get published? I'm not totally sure what's happening with the book. Now I want to edit it, but at the time I was like, maybe another year. In the meantime, what else do I do with my life? And I thought that I would write, I got the idea to create a subscription service and write daily, weekly, and monthly horoscopes for all of the sun signs. And that's essentially what I did, at least for 6 months. I did have a subscription service, and writing daily horoscopes was not something that I liked, I realized. Writing about the lunar transits was really taxing for me because they happen so quickly, and it was kind of like building a sandcastle right by the shore and having it wash away every single day. Like there was a sense that this wasn't really what I wanted to write, though the practice of horoscope writing gave me a mathematical and geometrical understanding of astrology that I really love, because I would chart out, what solar houses the planets were falling in. So I started to get this even idea of like, okay, people with like Leo sun or rising are feeling this, and it's because Jupiter is following in this house. And, I started to gain these maps in my head that I wouldn't have had otherwise. So it was ultimately useful in that way. And it was useful in conditioning my work ethic. I was falling behind. I was always trying to get ahead to write like weeks in advance. And I found that it was really hard to write about astrology in the future when I first started. It was much easier to write about what was happening that day. And eventually I didn't have enough time for myself or to do anything because I was always having to write. And I would sit at my computer and just feel like this was the hardest thing to do. And I gave it 6 months thinking that one day it was going to get easier, and it just didn't. So that was a huge lesson for me in getting to kind of like reel back in an offering and choose something else. I told my subscribers that, in a month's time, I was going to change my offering and do just weekly and monthly. And then I switched to just, forecasts, where I was writing about the energy for everyone. And that was an interesting switch because people really like to read horoscopes, and horoscopes are valuable to write. And I speak of horoscope in terms of like Aries through Pisces, and so that's one route to go into. Why I wanted to move into the forecast route and talk about the energies at large was that I was getting all these ideas that I just couldn't fit into, this is how your day is going to go. This is kind of what's in the air. For you personally, like I wanted to talk about these big themes. And then the challenge was, how do you encapsulate a week? How do you title an article or say what the theme is for the week when, just like you read someone's natal chart, sometimes you see a really clear theme, and other times there's kind of like these different energies that play, and you're not quite sure what the main through line is, except for us, because we're using Pluto in the notes. We do have a way of accessing a narrative. For collective, like writing astrology, I tend to not include the nodes as much, like they're kind of background context, except when planets square them. And then you can really feel that. For example, our Scorpio planets are activating the Aquarius and Leo axis, and they're being resolved through Leo. And that was a really huge moment of, we can use that information that we have specifically from the evolutionary lens in our writing, because that's a unique perspective. Not all forms of astrology talk about the lunar nodes or when planets square them. But just if you see right now the way that the collective is feeling, and like things that are coming up on Facebook, a lot of trauma, Aquarius is up in the air. And there's a lot of kind of like navigating these trauma matrices, and been like public shaming and these kind of like mass movement things. And the Leo side, if that's where Scorpio gets resolved through, struck me as a sense of could we move out of this, trauma mindset and this matrix of various forms of trauma and the remembrance of societal trauma and create something and, co-create a new reality. And that could play out on a very personal level, as many of us are probably experiencing our own personal microcosms of what the collective is experiencing. So a point I can make from that is that when we're writing astrologically, we're taking our knowledge of astrology, but we're applying it to what's happening here. One of the main sources of information I get is Facebook, like my news feed, because I have a wide variety of Facebook friends. I probably could be more well-rounded in that way, and at the same time, I'll get to audience concerns later. But Facebook, and then conversations I have in various communities I'm in and people that I cross paths with, I found that when I started to watch the transits, and even especially when I first started, now it's a little bit easier to write things quickly or to look at the transits for next week and sit down and write it in one day. But when it was still this like more difficult thing that I was forming a practice with, it would help to write out the transits that were happening that I was going to be writing about, kind of like let my subconscious work on it, and then just go out and have experiences and talk with people. Eventually, part of what drew me away from having a subscription service was that I was starting to write things that I felt could be useful to a larger audience. And I would get these downloads about how the archetypes could be used for thriving versus the kind of shadow or difficult or problematic things that occur. And I just felt on a business end too, it didn't even make sense. Like I had a small amount of subscribers, and it seemed like smarter business-wise to just share my writing freely and build an audience. And then that audience could later work with me if they wanted to. But there just seemed to be something about, I really did struggle with this on a lot of layers emotionally in terms of the amount of work and effort and like sweat and tears. There was definitely weeks I cried from not wanting to write, but feeling like I had to, especially before I stopped the subscription thing, where I had this kind of contract. I felt like I was driving myself into the ground, and I didn't want to give it all up, but I just had to find a different way of doing it. But one thing that I realized from it was that I did care about having an audience. I really liked connecting with people and having my writing maybe be a vehicle to help change the world in a positive way. Because in a micro sense, having an awareness of my own natal chart has enabled me to play with my archetypes, to know, okay, my moon's in Taurus, and this is what it could look like in a shadow way. It's opposite Pluto, like here's all the things. And then here's what it could look like in a more actualized or empowered way. And you can kind of download a whole spectrum in your imagination if you just feel it, but also research. The more that you know, the more that you can imagine. That happens in the microcosm. So when you're writing astrological writing for a group of people and like a whole transit that's happening, you can access the sense of how is this transit going to be difficult for people, what's going to come up, and what are some solutions. So I started to think when I was writing astrologically that it was this weird territory. Like before I started writing, I didn't have the same astrological community that I do now. I was kind of maybe knew like a few astrologers I could count on like one hand, and just knew a bunch of people that were not necessarily that into astrology. And so to just kind of come out in public as someone who's speaking the language of the stars was really weird. A lot came up for me with that. But philosophically, one of the things that came up was, if I'm translating a language that I've studied and want to disseminate and share with an audience, what kind of responsibility is implicit with that? That has been a huge spiritual or psycho-spiritual kind of development with my astrology practice, and just my, myself. I thought about it kind of no longer felt reasonable to have like signs that I just didn't like. Like I had to like investigate, why do I have a problem with this particular archetype? Because I don't want that to come across in my writing, especially when I was writing horoscopes, where it's like, some of the signs get like a royal treatment, and then another sign gets like all of my unprocessed angst at my ex who has that sign, It's just like, I can't do that. So that had to, I had to kind of work on what came up for me and what triggered me in the stars at any given time. And that applies also for kind of like the doom and gloom side of astrology that I don't like, like Saturn Pluto conjunction is coming up, and that's bringing up everyone's fears, like unanimously. And though we don't want to, the other extreme is to be so idealistic and to ignore the problematic or the shadow aspects of a quality sign, whatever, and to just kind of like gloss it over and to say something else, that also doesn't connect. I've found that when I write about, like I dig into, what feels bad. I know this like last week, before I kind of distilled something to write about the Scorpio planet squaring the nodes, it became so clear to me that digging into trauma, Aquarius, without any sense of creativity, it didn't feel good. Like there was some kind of ideal, Aquarius, of like, get into your shadow, do your shadow work, dig deep, just, go for it. And I realized that that's not always actually useful. Sometimes it's unsettling, and it's like kind of like violent or masochistic. And then I thought, oh, well, there's this square happening, or this T-square, and the Leo side is where these planets want to integrate. And so I took my own kind of trauma that I was thinking about, and I had an art project I had to do for class, and I was reimagining certain aspects of it, and that helped me move some energy through, instead of just trying to be so like analytical and cool and Aquarian about it at that way. So to reel that in a bit, people who are reading about astrology probably want to see a connection to their actual experience in your writing, as well as imagination of something else, something to aspire to. And so being able to hold both of those philosophically in analysis is a great service to people when it's one-on-one, and it's also a great service in astrological writing. And I think that that's kind of a spiritual and imaginative aspect of astrology, is to see, what are the potentials here, and how can I communicate this? And how can I also relate to people where they're at in their experience of the transits? So a quality that from the archetypal astrology world, they have this term multivalence, which describes the vast spectrum of ways that planets can play out together. And so they're always kind of holding that in their interpretations. And that's great for us too. And any kind of astrology is having a sense that these planets can create a multiplicity of theaters, and that we're also co-creators. For us, I think evolutionary astrology is so, there's so many resources within it. When I think about it as like a wisdom tradition, there's all these stories within it of, how people's energy kind of goes awry, where they're, even all the polarities, like someone who's South Node in Aries and North Node in Libra, maybe they've been at war in so many lifetimes, and whether it's literal war or kind of this metaphorical war, where they're just naturally very defensive. And this defensive quality that they have creates people that are defensive back, and then they feel attacked, and they create this feedback loop of always feeling attacked. And so if they just learn this Libra polarity, and what's that? And we talk a little bit about what Libra is, and the imagination follows that. And then if someone's so moved to act upon it and kind of shift their consciousness in a more Libran way, evolution can happen. So finding ways to really address what's happening in the transits, but to come up with an option for, greater potential and greater self-actualization. I think that's a gift that we can bring through with our writing. I'm just checking my notes. Okay, so in terms of biases, like our own personal biases, and how much of the person do you include in your astrology writing? One thing I think about a lot is if astrology is the domain of Aquarius and it's kind of this 11th house archetype, the opposite side of that is the 5th house and Leo. And so there is a persona that comes through. And I think that just like it's annoying within the science world when scientists claim to be objective, even though they're inherently subjective because they're human, and humans aren't the one perspective upon reality. Or just even that kind of trying to feign objectivity is, it's annoying, I think. But, so embracing that there's a personal voice coming through and personal opinions. And I've thought a lot about astrology as performance as well, bringing in the 5th house or the Leo aspect of it, because there's a balance of like having a lot of useful information, like information, the downloads that the 11th house brings, the astrology, the pure data. And then the presentation of it that makes it inviting or exciting and interesting to read. I've also wondered a lot about, how much of the person do you include? I think personality and flair is great. K. Pacha comes to mind. Like, he brings a lot of personality into his videos. But personal stories and like what's happening in a person's life, I tend to think that doesn't really need to be in astrological writing. Maybe it would be different if it's like kind of this, like a different genre of astrological writing, but not necessarily the forecast or like telling people what energies are happening. I've just noticed when I find that, and I don't find it that often, that I'm like skipping ahead and I want to read what else they have to say. But I also there's something in it where I think it loses connection, or it kind of breaks up the experience that you're creating for the reader to have an experience with the cosmos. And if they do that enough with your writing, they naturally do become curious about the person who is writing. And there's plenty of other space to share who you are, or, on your Facebook wall or other, special posts, and even, sharing astrological stories like this happened under this transit and putting that out there. But just being aware of like, if that wants to come through writing that is otherwise just about astrology, I think that sometimes it's kind of like a roadblock where some other kind of expression of astrology wants to come through, and it's hard to find the words because maybe you're so in the kind of 5th house Leo side of it that you know how it's affecting you, but you haven't gotten into the how does it affect the collective. And so to resist the urge to just make it about your own experience and to, zoom out the lens and then give yourself the expressive needs that you have to talk about your own life in another scenario. So you don't have to just be like anonymous or objective or kind of like this, wearing this astrologer hat, and you don't have an identity outside of that. but just knowing how to like, what your value system even is for compartmentalizing or integrating that. That's just my opinion, but I think that that's from my own experience, so it might not apply for everyone. The key about things being participatory, a lot of even language can be tricky and kind of dicey when we're talking about the transits, because we might say, oh, because Saturn is doing this, and it's always Saturn that we're blaming on stuff, but because Saturn's doing this, we're going to feel this. And that's actually not, I don't think that's objectively true. I think that we're feeling this and Saturn is reflecting that, and they're happening at the same time. However, I don't always make that distinction. It's hard to, I haven't yet figured out how to permanently adjust my diction and like how I phrase things to reflect that reality. And I think that would be a useful task, and I would like to figure that out. But every once in a while, I do make that point of, by the way, the planets aren't making us do anything. They're happening at the same time. They're reflecting us. But this, brings us into the philosophy piece of it. There are forms of astrology that are much more fatalistic, or would predict, the time of death and these specific life events. And then evolutionary astrology and psychological astrology has been a lot more about personal transformation and the vast possibilities and the capacity for personal transformation and personal participation in the transits. So then you come to the aspect of, what kind of, am I giving advice in my writing, or am I just talking about what's happening? And how do I give advice without sounding preachy or didactic? Those are just language skills, and also feeling if you're writing something and it feels didactic or preachy and that feels icky, then, listen to that and work with that and go deeper into that. And then, yes, there is also a place to give advice and to say, oh, this transit would be great for this. Something that happened through writing these forecasts was realizing that what I was saying could be useful and really interesting and relevant, but there was no possible way that I would encapsulate the whole transit or the whole atmosphere. That's like trying to tell anyone, explain all of reality at this moment right now. Just lay it all out. People are just going to give their unique perspective. So I stopped, I guess, writing in a way where I was trying to present the information I was sharing as though it were the only possible perspective. And now that I say that, I'm not really sure what shifts in language that has been. I'll think about that more, but it's also kind of been an internal shift in not feeling pressure to say everything, to be okay with taking an angle on a transit. Was another thing I wanted to bring up, is having a spin or an angle on a transit is a way to produce really interesting writing. Because if you're just, generalizing, that's something that, can be helpful, or you can do that. But if you want to kind of zoom in on something or integrate, a different idea into it, you can micro-focus on part of the astrological landscape. And that still often really connects with people. It's the same as in your own natal chart, learning more about one planetary placement and not the whole map in an integrated way that's still rich. I got one chat question here. It was a question saying, how would you describe the collective? That's really interesting. I guess I think of the collective as the, humanity. But it also could be, the non-human realms too, and animals, and I mean, it could be everything. So I guess it's relative, what we're talking about, and how we that's philosophical too, in terms of, do we affect people maybe who don't even speak the same language as us because of how we interface with reality, the butterfly effect, things like that. But it could also be more local or more just like, audience or culture, because different cultures are experiencing different things. Another thing about giving advice is that because we're in the transits at the same time as the audience or the collective that we're writing for, we're not somehow immune from having a process with them ourselves. This made me think a lot about the Cancer Capricorn axis of like the struggle of like, do I show up to write or work today because I don't feel good? And like the Cancer is like, I don't feel good, and Capricorn's like, work hard anyway. And I feel like the balance of it is maybe realizing that the pain or the things that we're going through are relevant to everyone else's struggle, and that if we can access that on the map, we can find an answer to it and then share it as medicine. When I first started my blog, a lot of my blog posts were just kind of like having some kind of painful emotion, processing it, finding wisdom inside of it, and then sharing the wisdom without sharing my own personal story of where the pain came from, because that was too vulnerable for me and also just like not what I wanted to share. But it did give me this kind of x-ray on reality where I thought, like, how much of what we consider beauty or wisdom or whatever is sourced from pain, or it's kind of like the compost or the soil, or like, where do things grow out of? And for astrology writing, this can be really potent because we're just getting into it. And so I would say be prepared in your astrology writing and your astrology offerings to work with your own stuff. And then the other side of that is I would say that we're allowed to download and disseminate advice that we ourselves also need. We're not only allowed to say things that we've already integrated, like we're perfect ministers of knowledge and we have it all figured out. It's okay to write advice that you end up having to take yourself. I had a massage therapist once who was telling me that she gives advice to her clients all the time that she needs to take herself. And she said, but where would I be if I only gave advice to people that I also took? And I feel like that's a Virgo thing we can look into, where it's like this excuse-making tendency or desire of like, I'll show up to write and share my astrology knowledge when I'm perfect, when I know astrology well enough, when I don't have inner demons. The psycho-spiritual work that shows up by writing about the cosmos and having esteem in what you write is always going to bring stuff up. And that doesn't need to stop us. There was something that I really wanted to say, and now I'm forgetting, but if I remember it, I'll come back to it. The other piece is writing about current events astrologically, or like writing for the week, next week. These events are already happening. Just because the transit goes exact and that's what I'm writing about, it's been building up. So I really pay attention to how I feel, what I see happening in my life. Obviously, if I'm going through a major thing, that could cloud up my vision. And so having to at least strive for greater objectivity without the illusion of actually being objective, I might feel compelled to, see a therapist, which I do see a therapist, and, or get some kind of healing work so that I'm not just projecting my own stuff onto the planets, which is bound to happen anyway. to some degree because we all have a personal filter and personal experience. But where it's too much, where it's clouding my ability to offer something, that's a good time to, work through stuff, whether it's, through yourself or through prayer or with the help of someone else. But when writing about astrological transits, there's a field happening around us that we're writing about, and so everything can be an inspiration. This is what I love about astrology, is that it connects to every discipline. There's nothing that can't synthesize with astrology. I haven't found it yet. Literature, for me, has been, I like that synthesis if I'm writing and a specific writer comes to mind, or like their energy appears. And then I look them up, and sure enough, they have very similar archetypes towards what's happening now. And there's a quote that they've said that's perfect for a transit. So trust the things that come up in your, free association or your imagination while you're writing. Depth psychology has also been a great combination with astrology, because one thing I read, I don't remember who coined this or said this, but the idea that psychology is to the modern what fate was to the ancient. And not necessarily that we don't still believe in fate, but the point being that people treat psychology like it's just like, oh, like that's just my personality. But it was personality is synonymous with fate. And yet depth psychology and transformation will show us that our personality can change. The core, or Pluto, or, the core of who we are doesn't change, but we might access more empowered sides of ourselves. I forget why I started talking about that. Just that there's inspiration everywhere. And so you can also, listen to what's emerging within you, because you're part of the cosmos. So even if what you're writing about doesn't appear to be personal about your own life, you are processing the things that are emergent for you on an intellectual layer at the same time that they're emerging in the planetary sphere. And in terms of writing things far out into the future, I still think of that, since most of my astrology writing is local time-wise, it's about this week. When I do stretch out into the future, I've noticed that it's just it's like time traveling a little bit. For any kind of astrological writing, I do think the universe, especially if we make a prayer or an intention, it almost like it conspires to help us or to inspire us. We just have to kind of know how to listen and be attentive. I think it's kind of a Gemini-Sag axis thing, where Sagittarius wants to know and is going to seek and ask the question. But then Gemini is the attentiveness to these micro trickstery opportunities that appear, and these things that are kind of bifurcations or forks in the road that lead to some kind of knowledge. So paying attention to when you ask a question and you want to know something, that the knowledge can come to you in all sorts of fun ways. And it doesn't, it can be in a meditation, it can be like through writing, it can just be in things that cross your path. So being alert and attentive to the way that the universe is flirting with us all the time, and it's going to share with us the answers to our questions if we just ask and know how to listen to the universe talking back to us. Astrology is an amazing tool for gaining that knowledge, and just calibration compass tool of how does my inner reality and my experience line up with these symbols. It's just a thread to build. But then for writing about transits far out into the future, that's contacting something that hasn't, I guess, happened yet, though on a non-linear time way. These are difficult questions to unpack, I guess, because I do think that there's some element of the future's already happened, yet we can change it. So I think a little bit about maybe parallel realities at play. Like, I haven't fully developed these theories, but if we're going to throw our arrow really far out into the future of like, okay, or not so far, but far enough, like the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, it's kind of similar to just the concept of focus itself, where if I'm to meditate on a particular concept, it's going to color my consciousness for a time period. The same goes for looking far into the future. If you really want to know something about a future transit, it's almost like the future will come into the present and share with you things. And so we might just kind of feel it. And that, I think, is kind of the adventure and maybe the perils of astrological work and writing, is that you really are traveling into these other dimensions and playing with these ideas. And so having I didn't even include this in my notes, but now it's just coming up, the sense of, are there ways to clear energies that you play with when you're astrological writing, and channeling and downloading information from, reading the map and getting these kind of impulses and ideas. And, maybe when you're really onto something, you have some kind of cue, like tingles up your spine, or like, you can feel that you're onto something. Is there a way to kind of create a sacred container for this experience? And then a way to close the space. And that's maybe an example of me giving advice that I don't myself take, but I've thought a lot about. In past times, I have definitely created like a ritual space to write. And then the channel, like my writing flow, opened up so much that there's times where I write all day and my surroundings go, like I just can't even clean or anything. And I don't really like that. I try not to do that. I try to be really balanced and integrated. But because of the consistency and just hours over years that I write, I can just kind of sit down and write, and I don't have to create a ritual space. But I do think it would be nice if I did, and I may notice some upgrades or some energetic ease that comes in, or maybe just maybe there would be something more clean about it for me, of kind of like sitting down to write and then stopping and being finished or something like that. But those are just musings. It's like one of those things. But I think that why I thought of that was that, for example, like I have Saturn and Pluto in aspect natally, so maybe thinking about the Saturn-Pluto conjunction doesn't constrict me more than I'm already used to the interplay. Like I have them in hard aspect, they're squaring, so I do get the sense of, if I want to write about that, I have to imagine it's different when they're conjunct instead of square. But by focusing and meditating on Saturn and Pluto, I will invoke in myself all my memories of Saturn and Pluto, the just feeling of it, the triumphs of it. Like Saturn and Pluto is very robust too. I think it's has the potential to be just, there's like gravitas and like a hardness to it. But then there's also this kind of like separation and moralizing destruction and things like that are more problematic. But so being prepared as you focus on these energies to see them unfold. And yeah, I mean, I wrote about the Aries Libra axis, and immediately after, found myself in a fight with someone. I don't really fight people that much, but it was like a verbal battle, and I was just like, oh, I just wrote about Aries and Libra axis. Sure enough, it was this, theme coming up of being tired of, I was done being nice, basically, when I had just been being, diplomatic for long enough, and I lost my temper. And so the animated kind of storybook of astrology is a very real thing, and I think it's a total trip. I really like it. So I would say be prepared for that. And any writer, I think I grew up with, like, you know, a lot of my writing idols were insane and like intense people, and very maybe depressive or melancholic and moody. And it built this construct for me that writers and creators have to suffer. I don't really believe that exactly anymore, but I believe there's tension in the creative process. And so that's going to come through in some way, and we can also have fun with it. It doesn't have to be like existential misery. And luckily, because we have all these archetypes and their multivalence and their empowerment and their disempowerment and the whole spectrum, we get to imagine transits while still keeping our foot in one, you know, realm where, okay, here's all the problems, but how do we midwife a more exciting engagement with these particular transits? Those are, I guess, some of the main philosophical questions that I've played with since I've been astrology writing. And the other piece to mention about the performance quality of it is the sense that it is writing for an audience. Like, I've noticed that the writing style that I've developed and my capacity to communicate is always, it's in conversation with an audience. And that's way different than if I were writing, you know, like the novel I wrote. That was also written for an audience, but I wrote it with a sense of, like, you know, timelessness. Like, in my, you know, biggest fantasy of it was like, this book could, you know, outlive me. And that was like the thing that inspired me and got me to sit down to write it. And astrology can do that too. But there's, why I think about that is that the audience or the people reading it are shaping me, or they're shaping you. And that is really sacred. That's really interesting. And I got into, I started my blog after I studied evolutionary astrology with Ari Moshe in Olympia, Washington. And I learned about Aquarius and Uranus and the whole, you know, individuated stage in EA. And I had all this faith and courage because of those teachings to just produce my writing and allow an audience to appear who resonated with it. Versus, you know, I got plenty of feedback when I first started. And even as a writer, like, I've had different phases of my writing practice where I've been really open to criticism and critique and wanting to, you know, to know what people think and how I can change it. And phases where I'm like, I don't care what you think, and this is what I wrote, and you can take it or leave it. And that, when I started the astrology thing, the blog, I did want to communicate. I wanted to be clear and to be understood, but I really resisted the sense that I had to alter my astrology writing to be more simple. Like, that was what I got a lot, was like, write in a more simple way so that more people can understand you. And these were coming from people that were kind of like not totally sure what I was doing, didn't really know that much about astrology, but like saw that I was like a little fledgling, like struggling to get something up. And they're like, you know, okay, like, just make it more simple. But that's not what I wanted. And ultimately, the people that did come to resonate with my writing, there's something so magical about, they are resonating with something that I'm putting out there. And I'm not putting it out there to appease an imaginary audience or the audience that, you know, some, you know, magazine on how to market told me. And I think that that's this industrial kind of consumer culture, whatever, worldview. And astrology blasts that open. You know, we're looking into the cosmos, we're looking beyond that. And so there is a chance, you know, we just have a few more minutes, so I'll wrap it up. whether it's your writing or even like astrological speakers are really magical. I saw Caroline Casey speak at Bioneers, and I hadn't heard of her before, didn't know of her work, and it was like a peak experience of my life to hear this woman talk about astrology in the way that she did. And there was the astrologer Rosie Finn in Olympia, who I love to see speak. Kay Pacha and Timothy are also astrological speakers. There's other mediums to disseminate astrological information. So whatever you connect with, I think that there's this exciting possibility within it, that it's this art form, it's philosophy, it's this combination of, you know, transmitting information, telling, but you're also creating an experience and have that potential to kind of bring the cosmos down into this kind of digestible offering that still can bring people to other places in the universe. And so it's a really exciting genre of creation in that way. It's like being a reporter, but you're talking about these cosmic things. So we just have, I guess, a few minutes. So if anyone wants to ask any questions.
Sabrina, have you been approached to do sun sign columns or anything like that?
Yeah, I did one, and it was a paid offering, and I think I was just thinking about this today, like in New York, there's a lot of like, publications and magazines and stuff that take astrologers, and so I think there's jobs out there for astrologers in that type of writing.
I don't particularly have a question, but I like what you said at the very end of writing in a way that brings the cosmos, the language, the communication of the planets down to Earth. And I think that's what a lot of people connect with. Because some people, you know, when they write about astrology, they write about it from up here. And when people can't feel like they can see that and see themselves valued as a piece and a part of the cosmos and not from this hierarchical, you know, I'm up here, I'm telling you this, that, and other, and you're just a peon. When they can't connect, when they don't feel validated as a part of, you know, the cosmos, they have a hard time connecting with it. So I like what you said about that.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, beautifully said.
Sabrina, I always love your perspective on things, and particularly I loved what you were talking about, invoking the archetypes and how they, you know, then can almost take on a life of their own, or just kind of act out in your life. That's beautiful. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, Sabrina, it looks like you've covered it all. Thank you so much. That was very enjoyable and helpful. And would you all please thank Sabrina Monarch?
Thank you, Sabrina. It was amazing. Thanks for sharing how you do it.
Thank
So
you.
very interesting.
Thank you. I loved it.
Thank you so much. It was great.
Sabrina. Awesome.
Thanks, Sabrina.